everybody. My name is Dave Medeiros. I'm with the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. Our mission is to educate and influence people to prevent accidental injury and death. And we have the great opportunity once again to participate or to provide one of our Friday freebie webinars. And this one right now is very timely and beneficial in the fact that it's heat stress prevention. And once again, we have one of our favorite speakers today to talk to us about this. She is Adele Abrams, who is the CEO of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council, as well as a safety professional and an attorney. So we get the best of both worlds out of Adele, and it's always very encouraging to hear what she has to say. And I can't think that I have heard one of her webinars that I did not pick up something, and I've been a safety guy for over 30 years. So really interesting, very exciting to have Adele talk to us again today. So without listening to me blather on a whole heck of a lot, I will turn it over to Adele.
Well, thank you, Dave, and welcome everybody. And when we talked about doing this as well, the Friday freebie, and I definitely like having that series available to you. We were talking about this last month, and I said, heat stress, good topic. Yeah, it is getting toward the end of the summer. Maybe people won't be that interested. And boy, here we are, Friday the 13th, the dog days of August, as they used to say. I love dogs, so I never saw that was a pejorative thing, but now I know what it means because I'm panting like a dog and sweating like a pig when I'm out there, right? And I was just looking at my weather app, as you were doing the intro here, and today, where I am in the Delmarva Peninsula, as I like to say, which is under Chesapeake Region Safety Council's purview, our heat index today is going to be 115 degrees. Now, I'm not going to say I'm old. I'm going to say I'm experienced. But I honestly don't remember having these, day after day, as we've been having this summer, where we have triple-digit heat indexes, and in some cases, the actual temperature remaining sustained for triple digits for multiple days. And of course, Maryland, Virginia, all that weather, it's over our region, and it is a real shift. Again, some of you just anecdotally may have realized, hey, I have like some light summer jackets and sweaters, and I haven't worn them all year. Yeah, that's because we are in some extreme temperatures, and I am not going to turn this into going down the primrose path discussing climate change here, because I know I'm bound to take somebody off if I do that. But we are having extreme heat, regardless of the causation, and it's deadly. And that's really, we're about safety here at the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. And so we're going to be talking about this largely through the prism of workplace safety and health. But please, everything we're going to be talking about here, especially when we get to the solutions part of the program, which I always like to lay out the problem and then give you some solutions. There's a lot there that I think you can use off the job as well. So this is not just about workplace safety that you can kind of tune out as soon as the whistle blows. How deadly is this? Well, we have 815 U.S. workers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who died over an extended period. And, nearly 100,000 workers by now have become seriously ill or seriously injured as a result. But the facts are that there's a lot more heat-related injuries and fatalities than are really captured because, they look at the direct cause. Somebody collapses from heat stroke, and we're going to talk about the different types of heat illnesses in a little bit here. And if they perish from that, that is counted as a heat death or heat illness fatality. But there are many other things. Your work performance generally is going to be adversely impacted if you are starting to slide into heat stress and then heat stroke. You can have injuries from falls. People whose mental acuity is compromised because they are suffering the adverse effects of heat and they get struck by vehicles, perhaps working in a work zone, mishandling machinery. All of these things can be indirectly caused if you're doing a good, robust root cause analysis by the heat situation. And of course, cold weather extremes cause illness as well. And maybe next winter, or if we have a winter, we'll talk about that too. Now, another misconception is that heat issues in the workplace really only have to do with outdoors. And yes, most of the fatalities have occurred in outdoor operations, but that is not exclusive. And we're going to talk about which industries are affected both indoors and outdoors in a moment by heat stress. But up to 70% of the outdoor heat stress fatalities occur in the first few days, and that is largely because they have not acclimatized the worker. That's a word you're going to hear me continually repeat. And again, you probably have experienced it yourself unknowingly, even if you're not focused on it from an occupational safety and health perspective. I was joking to my husband last night. I went out on the deck after the sun started going down, and came in after a little bit, and I said, "Boy, it's really cooled down out there. The heat index is down to 97 now." And I was joking, but at that point, it started feeling almost comfortable or reasonable out there compared with what it had been, at the height of the day at noontime when I was silly enough to venture out. They say only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the noonday sun. And recently, sometimes my dogs don't even want to go out. So I am part English. I guess that explains the madness. Now, beyond that, though, again, think about that. 70% are killing workers in their first few days of work. And that is definitely something that gets OSHA's attention. We're going to talk about OSHA enforcement as well as part of the program. But if they find out that you didn't do training, you didn't do any kind of acclimatizing of your worker, and they pass out and then they pass away, they are going to be looking at enforcement action. So as I mentioned, extreme heat, we typically look at outdoor, construction being the main one, mining being another. I do a lot of work in the mining aggregates, quarries, cement operations. And I remember a couple of summers ago being at a cement plant over in West Virginia and having to walk, across a large expanse out in the noonday sun. It was about 97 that day, probably the heat index about what it's going to be today. And I really had, questioned whether I was going to make it from my car to where the building was. It was just so darn hot out there. And yet the workers, they're acclimatized to it. It really was not bothering them. But what about indoor workers? Yes, you do have heat sources that can contribute to ambient heat. You have facilities that maybe are not air conditioned. I have some manufacturing plants that I work at that seem to be, metal buildings, and they keep the bay doors open on either side. And that's what passes for ventilation, which is fine under normal conditions. But when you get up into extreme heat, that isn't going to cool it down sufficiently. Warehouses, same thing. Cement operations, not to be picking on my friends in the cement industry, but they have huge kilns that throw off incredible amounts of heat. I was inside one of those buildings in South Carolina one time in the summer, and again, the ambient temperature in there was probably up around 120. It was pretty insane. And foundries, again, similar things. Anything in the iron and steel industry, you're going to have those exposures. Now, there was a study done by UCLA just this year, and it was presented to Congress just a couple of months ago. That kind of startled me, but I'm glad that we're trying to quantify this information. And what they found was that on days when the ambient temperature is between 85 degrees Fahrenheit and 90 Fahrenheit, the overall risk of injury, now we're not talking about death, we're just talking about injury, regardless of the official cause, was 5 to 7% higher than on days when it's in the 60s. And then when temperatures as they are today, likely going to top 100 degrees in some areas, the overall risk of injury goes up by 10 to 15%. And again, that's across the board. That is the motor vehicle accidents, that's the falls, that's the cuts, that's confined space situations. Just because people, their minds are not really on the job. Heat stress can cause difficulties in concentration, and it can cause fainting, which again is one of the causes of the falls. Another thing is that this is not something that is kind of an equal opportunity illness creator. Low-income workers tend to be more adversely affected, in part because they tend to be working a lot of these jobs outdoors, in construction, in landscaping, and agriculture, for example, working long hours out there. But also they tend to be workers just generally who are in more hazardous industries to begin with. Workers who are all day in an air-conditioned office or an air-conditioned even manufacturing facility, they're going to be at a lot lower risk of heat stroke or heat stress than other workers. And then more males are exposed to extreme heat, again, because they tend to gravitate and more heavily populate these, I'll call them blue collar, outdoor, heavy industrial jobs. And similarly, workers in their 20s and 30s are going to be more adversely affected because there are more of them in those jobs as well than people say in their 50s and 60s. So moving right along here, what are the things that create exposure to heat stress? Well, it's really any process or any job outdoors or indoors that is likely to cause a worker's core temperature to increase. And with COVID, we are all about, temperatures and are you running a fever? And this certainly complicates screening for COVID as well. We have to be honest about that. And conversely, some employers may be tempted to say, well, okay, your temperature is coming in at 100.3 or 100.8, but you're out here in the heat, and so we're not going to assume that it's COVID. We're going to assume that it's environmental exposure, and that can result in allowing workers who are positive for COVID to be in your workforce. I'm not even going to go down except a little bit here the COVID trail. I've got a couple of slides coming up. But beyond that, I just wanted to note that if you are still screening your workers for temperatures, as you need to do under some policies in some states or rules like Virginia OSHA, that can be a confounding factor. So if high air temperatures, obviously the radiant heat sources we talked about, high humidity, which we haven't, and my hair kind of gives testimony to the humidity factor on any given day. I can use that as my own benchmark. But when you have high heat and you have high humidity, that is when you get from, it's 87 and it feels like 87 to it's 87 and it feels like, or the heat index is, 98. And that too is where we are today, where the actual heat highest is going to be 95 where I am, but at that time, it's going to be 115 heat index. And that is that formula, and it is a mathematical formula used by the National Weather Service to come up with the heat stress index. I'm going to talk about that point a little bit later, and also some other things that you can use to kind of benchmark where things are. Direct contact with heat sources, you're sticking your head in the oven because you're a baker. That certainly is going to create exposures. Anytime you're doing strenuous physical activities, that also is going to exacerbate it. Whereas if you're, just sitting in a chair all day, you might be out in the heat. Maybe you've got one of those feather bedding jobs where you just get to sit and watch the laborers. You're still going to have some heat stress exposure, but not as much as the people who were, moving steel and, operating forklifts out there. And then there's specific areas that workers are going to be at higher risk. Ceramic plants, boiler rooms, and think about that. If you are, say, with a building management company, even though your building itself may be a low-risk facility, you do have people, your mechanical engineers, for example, who are working in your boiler rooms. And so you have to consider, do they need to have any kind of heat stress prevention training and accommodations? Confined spaces, extreme heat is obviously one of the hazards to consider when you're doing your initial risk assessment. Mine sites, smelters, foundries, steam tunnels are another one of those. We don't have a lot of those, but they have them in the DC Capitol, in the US Capitol. Again, you might have some of these locations where you least expect them in your facilities. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about personal risk, but the totality of your health factors is also going to impact whether or not, you are at a heightened risk for heat stress or heat stroke. Age, the older you are, the more likely you are to be adversely affected by the heat. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because I said people in their 20s and 30s are more affected, but that's simply because of the numerosity. There's more of them doing those types of work. But you put a 20-year-old and a 60-year-old together doing the same activity in the heat, the 60-year-old is going to be more adversely affected. Weight, obesity is one of the high risk factors for complications from the heat. Your general level of physical fitness and acclimatization, your metabolism, your hydration level, drinking water matters. Drinking fluids really matter, and can be the difference between life and death. We're going to talk about that. And then also, you have to look individually at medical conditions that you or an employee might have. Hypertension and renal disease, kidney disease, can place workers at elevated risk even before you get into the triple digits that I was talking about before. So let's move a little bit into the enforcement arena, and then we'll move into the proactive arena. First of all, OSHA has been doing a heat stress or heat illness prevention campaign since 2011. And the theme is water, rest, and shade. So those are the three takeaways. It's very simple. Provide adequate water to your workers. Make sure that they have an appropriate number of rest breaks given the totality of the conditions. And then make sure that shade, and if it's very hot out, air conditioning or some kind of personal cooling station may be required for that to give them some breaks. But the whole campaign idea was both to educate employers and workers about the dangers of heat. They have a variety of tools on their website, and I have some links at the very end of my presentation that you can use for additional tools. But basically, the takeaway is that they want employers to have effective heat stress prevention programs that include providing that water, rest, and shade, allowing your new workers or those returning to gradually acclimatize by increasing their workload over a period of time as they build tolerance for the heat. And I focus on returning workers because you may have people, who come back every summer, and you're viewing them as an experienced worker, a lifeguard, or somebody who works, on a stand at the boardwalk. That's out in the air. I'm using this just because I do live in a beach area, but obviously there are lots of other summer jobs that people return to. And the employer may just say, okay, well, they did this last year. They know how to run the traps. And you don't think about the fact that they haven't been putting in 8 or 10 hours in grueling heat, for, probably 9 months. You also should be training your workers on prevention, but planning for emergencies. How are you going to respond if somebody collapses? And monitoring coworkers. This is one of these situations where everybody has to have the other person's back. You really do. If you see somebody that you're working with and they're starting to mumble and they're not making sense cognitively, that's a sign. If you see somebody who normally is sweating like a pig and suddenly they've stopped sweating, that's a big red flag. We're going to talk again about symptoms a little bit later. Obviously, if somebody just keels over, you can't just leave them unattended. You need to get them heat. If you have somebody who lies down because of heat, they need to continue being monitored. So, there's a lot of, I guess, again, taking care of the next guy, paying it forward and hoping that they have your back as well. And also clothing. We're going to talk about PPE in a little bit here, but the short answer is OSHA says you have to still wear PPE regardless of how hot it is out. But they do say employers should consider heat factors, and this is right in a letter of interpretation they have out, when providing PPE to workers, such as fire-resistant clothing. That comes up quite a bit for people in the electrical trade, and I work with a lot of electrical companies. There are lighter weight and sun resistant with the sun protection factor, that are available. They may be more expensive than the cheapest FR clothing you can get. But if you have a crew of electricians who are going to be working outdoors in, triple digit heat index, they are going to need that so that they don't collapse, because what they're doing, very unforgiving work. And, the same thing goes for people who are working at heights in any job, frankly, or maybe out there again on a construction project where they're operating dangerous equipment such as cranes. Again, make sure your workers are aware that they can't be wearing 3 layers of clothing when it's 100 degrees out. So what about enforcement? This is a complicated topic, and frankly, I think that in the wake of the 2019 development, a lot of employers have said, well, OSHA can't really hold us accountable, so we really don't have to do anything. And that really is not true. It is true that federal OSHA does not have a specific standard dealing with heat stress hazards. What they have historically done is use their powers under the General Duty Clause, which is Section 5A1 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. And that says that employers must furnish to each of their employees employment and place of employment free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Clearly, heat stroke falls into that category. It is certainly a recognized hazard. But then under the General Duty Clause, you can only be cited if your own workers are exposed to the hazard and if there is a feasible method of abatement. And I want to be very clear about this. OSHA has the multi-employer citation doctrine, where a host employer or a general contractor can be cited as the controlling employer, along with the employer who created the hazard, the one whose workers are exposed to the hazard, and then whoever is responsible for abatement. And sometimes that is spelled out in contracts. So if you are a contractor who's coming in and you're going to be doing tasks outdoors in extreme heat, one of the things to address is, how are my people going to be able to cool off? If you, as the contractor, have no control over the physical environment, you may have to set up a portable cooling station. But if there are buildings that somebody could go into and cool off, maybe you're going to have to communicate with the building owner to allow some form of access there. And that can be spelled out again contractually with certain controls in place. Again, I don't want anybody to walk away saying, okay, if I've got contractors, I don't have to worry about heat stress, because while it is true that as the controlling employer, the host, you cannot be cited under the General Duty Clause, you can be cited under some of the standards I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So, again, take this with a grain of salt. Also, we're going to talk in a moment about state plan states. There are 22 of them who run their own OSHA programs, and there are now 4 of them that have adopted heat stress standards. Maryland and Virginia are not among them, although Maryland and Virginia do run their own programs. But let's say you're a multi-state employer and you have operations in California or Oregon or Minnesota. If you are implementing their mandated heat stress prevention programs, you've shown the feasibility of taking those actions. And then if you're not providing those same levels of protections to your workers in Maryland, DC, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, or Pennsylvania, you can be held liable because they can impute the feasibility of your program from those other states to your work sites in the states that don't have a binding standard. And so that's how they would backdoor that. Now, one of the problems, though, for OSHA in enforcing under the General Duty Clause is that they lost a big old case, the Sturgill roofing case, in 2019. And this is binding precedent. This was the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, which held against the agency and for the employer. This was on appeal. OSHA had won at the lower level, but on appeal, the commission said that OSHA cannot use the National Weather Service's heat index for enforcement purposes. And that has always been what they had been using to impute knowledge to employers. So back to the drawing board for OSHA. And in June of 2021, OSHA put out its semi-annual regulatory agenda, and a heat illness prevention standard is now on their reg agenda. They're going to be doing a request for information on this in October of this year. And they could fast track this because we do have obviously several state model rules that they could select from. Plus, the head of Cal OSHA is now nominated to be the head of federal OSHA. And Cal OSHA has had a standard on the books for a while. So I do think that they are going to fast track a heat stress or heat illness prevention standard at the federal level, certainly to get it through during this administration. But I think they're going to also try to get it done, I would say, by the end of 2023, just so that it cannot be, it will not end up being one of these midnight rules adopted in the last year of an administration in the event that there is a change in administration, which would allow it potentially to be rescinded, similar to what President Biden just did to the Trump Department of Labor independent contractor rule. And we saw that Trump did that to a number of the Obama administration rules as well. So that's always kind of a ping pong game. But this is one I think they want to get to the finish line and make sure that it'll stick. So take that for what it's worth. There's also legislation pending in Congress to require OSHA to do a heat stress prevention standard. And this was introduced in April of this year in the Senate. Sherrod Brown of Ohio is the leading sponsor, but there are 9 co-sponsors in the Senate. There are 53 co-sponsors to the House version of the bill, H.R. 2193. They're all Democrats, but, you know, this is one of those issues, you know, it's hard to vote against, really. I say that famous last words because there's a lot of things that people are voting against that are hard to vote against. But what would this rule require? It would define heat stress to include that the standard must cover both outdoor and indoor exposures to heat at levels that exceed the capacity of the body to maintain normal body functions and may cause heat-related injury, illness, or fatality. The rule would have to have a training and education component, and also whistleblower protections. And this, again, is a common theme. OSHA's electronic record-keeping rule had a big whistleblower component. OSHA's new national emphasis program on COVID has a big whistleblower component. So expect that to be included in generally any heat stress prevention standard. I think that does end up coming out. But in the meantime, in the absence of an enforceable heat stress prevention standard, federal OSHA has put out some guidance. They say, you know, basic abatement is allowing workers to drink water or cold liquids, sports drinks, at their liberty. Don't limit them to, you know, their break periods. You want to make sure that they have potable water, preferably cold water, accessible to them at all times. Also, establish provisions for a work-rest regimen so that exposure times to high temperatures or the work rate is decreased to give the person, you know, a little bit of a chance for their systems to go back to normal, so they're not being pushed until they finally collapse. You know, where I live, we've recently had an issue with the teenage lifeguards at our community pool, and the company that employs them, which is a contractor, has had several of their young girls who are typically 15, 16 years old collapse from heat stroke and have to be taken to the hospital. You know, in exploring this a little bit, you know, as the safety professional that I am, you know, I was able to identify a few issues, including the fact that these kids, in some cases, were working more than 10-hour days, which even violates child labor laws, but there really was no place for them to get out of the heat. Even the shady areas, when it gets into, you know, 90, 95-degree temperatures and 3-digit heat index, you're not getting a chance to cool off there. So, you know, that situation is still in the process of being addressed. And those are just examples, though. You know, if you see something, say something, because you may not be directly in the employment, but as a safety professional, you know, we have a duty to do hazard complaints to OSHA if we see situations that are violative and are actually putting people at risk, not just hypothetically. Another thing is basically to develop a heat stress prevention program. And they have 5 components to that: a training program to educate your workers about the effects of heat stress, what they need to do to prevent heat-induced illnesses, a screening program to identify employees with health conditions that could place them at an elevated risk. And yeah, I know everybody is saying, whoa, HIPAA, right? And yes, that is one P and two A's. Potentially, but again, we've gotten a bit more relaxed about screening programs due to COVID. And you can integrate, if you're still doing a COVID screening program, add some questions in there concerning heat stress exposure. That will help you, especially if you're using third-party screeners. That puts up a wall between the direct supervisor and firsthand knowledge of the people they supervise health conditions. Another is an acclimatation program, which basically, if you're going to be off of work for 3 or more days, you're going to lose some of your resistance to heat. So if somebody goes away on vacation for a week in the summer, when they come back, they're going to have at least some modest acclimatization to be done. Specific procedures to follow if you have a heat-related emergency. Are you going to try to have somebody on your team providing first aid? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. How close are you to a hospital or to first responders? That dictates under OSHA rules whether you have to have a first aid trained individual on site or not, and provisions about the administration of first aid. And remember, if your rules require somebody, who's your designated first aid provider, or multiple people to do that, then they have to have training on it. If it's Good Samaritan approach to things, then mandated first aid training does not apply. It's not citable. But as soon as you detail somebody who would be a designated first aid provider, you're going to have that. And I hate to say it, but you may be looking at bloodborne pathogen training as well, even though that typically is not something that relates to heat stress. If somebody, to use my lifeguard example, and I have warned them about this, fainting can be one of the first signs. If you're up, 8 feet in the air sitting on a chair and you faint, if you fall into the water, great. If you fall sideways and hit the pavement, now you have a teenager with a traumatic brain injury, that you may have some premises liability for, even if they're not your direct employee. So these are, again, just some examples of things that OSHA has recommended as guidance. Can they enforce this? No, guidance is not enforceable, but they certainly have it out there. They're doing this big campaign, as they have been since 2011. And if they find that employers had actual knowledge of this guidance, maybe through a trade association, for example, then that does impute knowledge to them. Now, what other things, though, does OSHA at the federal level have in their toolbox? They have a number of things. PPE. You have to protect your workers and do a hazard assessment for all of the hazards they would face in the performance of their job. And heat needs to be one of those. So when you do your hazard assessment under 1910.132, you have to consider extreme heat as one of the hazards of the job and respond accordingly. There are versions of that same general industry standard for construction, for shipyards and maritime, obviously. And for the general industry standard, you have to do a written hazard assessment. But for construction, you have to go through the exercise. It does not need to be in writing, but as I always tell my clients, how do you prove to OSHA you did it unless you have some kind of record of it? So still, I think it's a good idea to memorialize that. The next is record keeping and reporting. Under Part 1904, which covers the private sector, you have an obligation to record and to report certain work-related heat illnesses. So, in doing triage on whether it's recordable or not, if a worker has to end up getting IV fluids to treat heat illness, that is going to be medical treatment. That is going to go on your OSHA log. Now, if they only need to drink some fluids to hydrate, that's first aid. That is not medical treatment, and so it does not go on your log. Now, what about if somebody has to be taken to the hospital? If they are taken to the ER, that does not make it reportable unless they are admitted as an inpatient. If they are admitted inpatient, you have 24 hours to notify OSHA. And the occupational heat events that could trigger that are heat stroke, kidney damage due to dehydration. There's I can't even pronounce this properly. Rhabdomyolysis. Yes, that is a rare condition. I want to say that, and it does occur from other things beyond heat. But heat stress is one of the risk factors, and that can result in death or inpatient hospitalization. I will talk about that a little bit more later. So if any of those conditions end up hospitalizing your worker, you have to notify OSHA within 24 hours if the hospitalization occurs within 24 hours of the triggering event. Now, if the person dies as a result of their heat illness, you have to notify OSHA within 8 hours. Some of the states, if you're a multi-state employer, some of the state plan states have a shorter period in which you have to notify OSHA. So be careful about that. It is not one size fits all. And you have to notify them about a heat or any kind of work-related fatality if it occurs within 30 days of the triggering event. So here's where it gets complicated. You have a worker who gets hospitalized for heat stroke. You notify OSHA within that 24 hours. You've done your duty. But then let's say day 17, they die. They went into a coma initially, which does happen, and eventually they passed away from it. Because they passed away within 30 days, you now have to notify OSHA again that they passed away. So don't miss those, because it's a $5,000 mandatory minimum penalty if you miss notifying OSHA of those activities that occur, the hospitalizations or the fatalities. I want to mention MSHA just for a moment, because some of you may be contractors or may even work at mines directly. MSHA requires you to notify them within 15 minutes if somebody is dead on a work-related fatality, or if they incur an injury or an illness that has a reasonable potential to result in death, which heat stroke does. So if you have somebody working at a quarry or a sand and gravel operation or a cement operation, and they are taken to the hospital, that's different. You don't wait to see if they're admitted. With MSHA, you notify them within 15 minutes of calling 911, or it's a mandatory minimum $6,200 penalty now. So that's kind of a big deal. Now back to OSHA. Sanitation. We always think about that standard as having to do with the porta potties, but it also requires employers to provide adequate potable water, that's drinkable water, not portable, to their workers. And that is across the board in all industry sectors that are regulated by OSHA: general industry, construction, the shipyard and maritime, and agriculture. Medical services and first aid, I mentioned that before, and those standards require that you have somebody on site who is adequately trained to render first aid if you don't have medical facilities in close proximity. I've had people cited for this, not related to heat stroke, but a whole bunch of times on other kinds of injuries. And typically OSHA seems to look at it, if the first responders can get there within 5 minutes of a call, or you're within 3 miles of a hospital or urgent care facility, then usually you don't have to have someone who's first aid trained. But if you are in a more remote work location, then that is an obligation you have. And then finally, OSHA itself says that heat stress prevention training should be covered as part of your construction mandated training under 29 CFR 1926.21. So while they do not enumerate subjects in that standard, you're supposed to cover all of the health and safety hazards that somebody could be exposed to on the job. And so that is another way they can tag you for heat stress, even though right now their hands are tied a little bit at the federal OSHA level in terms of using the general duty clause. And remember, for the 22 states, including Maryland and Virginia, the fact that federal OSHA was told they couldn't use the National Weather Service Heat Index, that's not binding on the Maryland and Virginia courts, who ultimately have the burden of interpreting the law for those for Virginia OSHA and Maryland OSHA. So there's still the potential for people to be cited there. Now, among the other states within our purview under Chesapeake Region Safety Council, Delaware, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and DC, they are all under federal OSHA. So right now, that bar on using the general duty clause, at least via the National Weather Service. And again, that's a sticking point. That's the only thing they said you can't use for imputing knowledge under the general duty clause. But there's more than one way to get to your end result, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So moving on here, what about those state OSHAs? Well, as I mentioned, there are now 4 states that have adopted standards for heat stress prevention. The big one, of course, is California. Their heat illness prevention standard, which may well end up being the model for a federal rule, requires employers to provide training, water, shade, and planning. Same basic elements seem to recur in all of these. But the key is that 80 degrees Fahrenheit is the trigger for the requirements. And I've given you links here, which should work for you if you get the materials, so that you can find each of these standards. Given that we did make this a shorter webinar, I can't go through all of these in detail. But as I said, Doug Parker, who had been the head of Cal OSHA until he joined the Biden transition team on safety and health issues, he is the nominee. He is cleared at this point by the Senate Help Committee to be the new OSHA chief, but they adjourned for their summer August recess without bringing that to the full Senate floor. But I expect him to pass. I don't think that he's going to be voted down for any reason. Minnesota is the next one, but theirs is limited to indoor places of employment, which is kind of odd, given the heat factors that we have at outdoor employment. I think that this may have been driven because they have so much of the steel production up in the Iron Range. And I have been there. I worked with some of those companies. And not only is it 35 below zero in the winter, but then you go inside the facilities and you burn to death, from the radiant heat, as they make steel pellets and some of the other functions that they do. So I think that's what drove Minnesota, since that's not typically a state known for its heat. The next one is Washington State. And they're, it's like the flip side of Minnesota. Washington State's OSHA rule only applies to outdoor heat exposures. And finally, Oregon, they just adopted a temporary emergency heat stress prevention standard on August 6th of this year. So this is last week. This is breaking news for you, folks. And this was in response to the deadly heat that they've been having in the Pacific Northwest, which of course also impacts Washington State and Cal OSHA. They had started a rulemaking for a heat stress prevention rule back in February, but this kind of required them to double time it because they had a lot of workers who are being adversely affected out there. And they are continuing with the permanent rulemaking in Oregon, even as they start enforcing the temporary heat stress prevention standard. So what's in that? Because again, since this is the latest one out of the gate, it I think is a good one to look at because it's similar again to Washington and Cal OSHA in a lot of ways. First of all, this is a hybrid. The Oregon OSHA rule that just took effect last Friday offers protections for both indoor and outdoor environments, except if heat is generated by a work process, such as in foundries. So that's an odd little exemption that they carved out there. But they also, I think, looked at it that there are other codified standards dealing with boundaries that they can fall back on there. Now, when the heat index, as I said, equals or exceeds, the heat index temperature is 80 degrees Fahrenheit or greater, this temporary rule requires the employer to provide access to shade and to drinking water for workers. And then when you get into higher heat, when the ambient heat index goes to 90 degrees or above, employers have to have an emergency medical plan in place, have procedures to follow. If workers are showing signs of heat illness, you have to develop and implement an effective acclimatization practice plan. And then, basically, already you have to ensure that workers have training on heat-related illness and how to prevent it. So again, you may be based in Virginia, you may be based in, Pennsylvania, but if you have an Oregon location and you are implementing this program, they can impute knowledge of that program and the feasibility of implementation of that program to you in Pennsylvania or in Maryland or Virginia or DC to show that it was a recognized hazard and it is feasible for you as the employer to address. Now, what about COVID? I promised I would get the C word in here. And yes, OSHA has actually issued guidance, separate guidance, in fact, for outdoor workers and indoor workers who have to wear the cloth face coverings as part of their job activities. For outdoor workers, OSHA recognizes that wearing a cloth face covering may be uncomfortable, especially when it is hot and humid. And so OSHA says, no, they don't say just don't wear them, sorry. They say the employer has to acclimatize new and returning workers to the environmental and work conditions while they are wearing the face covering. So, right out of the gate, from day one, let them wear the face covering and gradually build up their endurance so they can work a full shift out in the heat while wearing it. Prioritize the use of face coverings for workers who are going to be in close contact, and that is still defined as less than 6 feet. I know some of the states, including the one that I live in, back in May when the CDC ill-advisedly said you don't have to wear masks anymore, they dropped it down to 3 feet. But that is not cutting it with the Delta variant, boys and girls. 6 feet is the distancing for social distancing. It continues to be that for workplace purposes. So also, if you have people who are traveling together in a group, or you're having an all hands on deck shift meeting, even outdoors, where you're gathered together, maybe you're doing a toolbox talk, you're doing your safety huddle. If people are going to be within 6 feet of one another to be able to hear, then they have to be wearing face masks, face coverings. Now you can, in these heat situations, outdoors, allow workers to remove them if they can safely maintain a 6-foot distance or more. But this is not something to play around with. I want to stress that. I know that people have different philosophies, but science is not philosophy in this case. I have a client who called me last Friday. They said we had one worker who was positive, and now 3 people that he worked in close proximity to are also positive. And were exhibiting signs of illness, and I helped them address some initial issues. They called me, Tuesday. They're up to 10 people out now, positive and sick with COVID. And these are all, cases that all seem to have been communicated in the workplace because none of these people had sick relatives at home, frankly. But now, if their relatives get sick and die, that employer is going to have some liability exposure outside of workers' comp. So bear that in mind. We are far from out of the woods on this at this point. So don't play the angles on this and say, well, I'm 5 feet 9 inches from the other workstation, but that's close enough for rock and roll and government work. It may be close enough for rock and roll and government work, but it's too close for the Delta variation. And now we've got Lambda and Gamma coming our way. So it's going to get worse probably before it gets better, sadly to say. Now, evaluate also the feasibility of wearing cloth face coverings. Maybe face shields will be a less constricting, but could still provide an equivalent protection. These are going to be case-by-case evaluations. If they are wearing a respirator already for a work-related reason, like silica prevention, an N95, you don't have to put a face covering on top of that, OSHA says. Just wear the respirator that is assigned to you. But when you take the respirator off, if you are, in a hazardous situation relevant to COVID, then you would need to put the face covering on at that point. Also, OSHA says increased frequency of hydration and rest breaks in shaded and non-enclosed or else air-conditioned areas. And try to use that 6-foot distancing, incorporating it in. So you're staggering your break times, you're limiting the number of people on break at one period, spacing out your workers where you can. There are these administrative controls that you can put into place that can prevent transmission of COVID while also hopefully keeping your workers from experiencing heat stress. Now, beyond that, what about indoors? OSHA says if you work in a bakery or a kitchen, laundries, electric utilities, and that includes boiler rooms, and electrical vaults. Um, uh, some of those vaults are going to be air conditioned, obviously, but if you're down in a manhole, that's going to be a different story. Fire services, mills, foundries, manufacturing, and warehousing. Those are the indoor workplaces that OSHA says can be affected by heat stress. And basically, they say everything that's on this slide is what you should be doing indoors as well. So I didn't repeat all of that for you, but there was nothing unusual for protection of indoor workers contrary to outdoor. They just have two different guidance sheets out on that. So having done all of that very quickly, I don't want to turn this into a first aid course here, but I do want you to understand what the symptoms are and what to do, whether you're on the job or off the job, if you or somebody with you is experiencing heat illness. First of all, on the acclimatization, it takes 5 to 7 days for the average person to adjust. But if you have one of these personal health factors, it may take you longer than that. If you're older, if you have heart disease, if you have, kidney conditions, diabetes, obesity. On the very first day that the person works in the hot environment, they are going to have an elevated body temperature, pulse rate. They're generally, going to be hating life and feeling discomfort. But as the time goes on, they will become acclimated to the temperature. And that happens with cold as well, by the way. But if you do not acclimate your person properly to the heat, there are a number of different illnesses, from the minor to the major. And I'm going to go through each of these: the heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, fainting and dizziness, heat rash, and then rhabdomyolysis. Yes, they don't teach that one in law school, I will say. And blessedly, I haven't had to encounter any of those cases in my career so far. I want to keep it that way. So we're going to go from the minor up to the major here. Heat cramps, that's basically muscle spasms, usually after some kind of exertion in the heat. Very often they'll involve your legs. They can affect other body parts if you've been working out and using those muscles. I experienced this earlier this summer myself. I was doing some volunteer work outdoors at a food bank on one of these days when it was up in the 90s, and I was basically walking a parking lot. And they did not provide shade, and they did not provide anything other than one bottle of water. And after 2 hours, both of my legs started cramping up, and I was like, okay, time for me to go. And I did a little bit of mini heat stress training for the organizers of this volunteer group on what they needed to do going forward this summer for similar kind of outreach activities. What do? You rest in a cool place. In my case, I went and sat in my car and turned the air conditioning on. That worked. Drink some cool water. Drink a sports drink with electrolytes. And no, we're not talking about Brondo from Idiocracy. But, drinks with electrolytes will help you if you are going into heat cramps or other heat stress. And stretching your cramped muscles. And you do that, you're pretty much good to go. The next is the fainting and the dizziness. And somebody who is not accustomed to the heat and they stand up suddenly, without moving, they can go right over. You can become dizzy, and again, I talked about if you're climbing ladders in the heat, for example, or you're up on an elevated work platform, maybe you're working in an aerial lift, you're going to have some potential fall exposure there. Basically, what happens is, your enlarged blood vessels keep your blood from circulating properly. If you lie down, you'll recover pretty quickly. And by moving around and not just standing static. And again, this is where like your flaggers, for example, on a work zone project, they could be at elevated risk for this because very often they are standing there static, holding the stop sign and then holding the slow sign. So keep an eye on people who are in those vulnerable situations. Heat rash, again, my mom called it prickly heat. This is something usually not going to kill you, but it's discomfort. You sweat, you're wearing clothing that is not friendly in terms of allowing the moisture to evaporate. And when your skin stays wet, your sweat ducts can become plugged, a rash can appear. Again, usually, you can treat that with over-the-counter stuff, but it can result in infection. And if that occurs and you require medical treatment, then that can morph into an OSHA recordable situation if it occurs in a job-related setting. And obviously, regular bathing, drying your skin, wearing clothing, wear life like a loose garment. Well, wear loose garments where you can to allow air to circulate. That's really the key. And you don't want to have to be training your workers on hygiene, but be aware if you have workers, where that may be a problem. Maybe setting up some kind of portable shower even, would be something that would be feasible. Or, in a changing area, encouraging them to just do a complete shower at the end of their shift rather than, a California bath, as they say. The next one is heat exhaustion. And that is a heavy perspiration, the sweating like a pig thing, as I said. Your body temperature is pretty much normal. It might be slightly elevated, but we're not talking about major elevation where you're going into organ shutdown, which is the next step we're going to talk about. But typically you get into heat exhaustion because you haven't been drinking enough water, or your salt levels are getting depleted, or both. The symptoms of this, severe thirst, fatigue, headache, nausea, vomiting, sometimes diarrhea. I will note that except for the thirst, all of those other things are also symptoms of COVID, including breakthrough COVID cases for the vaccinated. So be careful about that. You may be, treating horses, and actually there are zebras in the background. And then if you do not treat or control the heat exhaustion, your workers will evolve into heat stroke, and that is what is potentially deadly. But before we get to that, what do you do if someone has heat exhaustion? Get them out of the heat, put them into a cold place, give them cool liquids, water or sport drinks. In the heat exhaustion case, raise the victim's legs. That will encourage blood circulation. Get them out of excessive clothing, sponge them down with cool water. You can fan them, either mechanical fans or a lot of handheld ones now that you can charge with a USB port. Those are really helpful to have. There's also, and it's really low tech, but I have one that I use when I'm out at the pool or at the beach, and you can keep these on the job site. It's a water bottle that has a battery-powered little fan on top and a trigger. You can spray the water on the person, and then you turn the fan on. Boy, does that cool down quickly. So, even in mobile work sites, you don't have to have a high-tech solution. These low-tech things can be helpful. But if the person is not improving within 30 minutes, that's when, you're not in heat exhaustion, you're in heat stroke, and you need to call the emergency responders. So you're in heat stroke. Is it 911 time or not? This is the most serious of health problems really associated with this, other than that one odd condition that I'll just give you a slide on next. But there's two different types of heat stroke. There's classic. There's the slow cooker. You're out there over a period of days. The summer heat waves like we're having now, that's when this develops. It's got a 50% death rate due to affecting the elderly. So if you go into heat stroke, 50-50 chance you're going to survive it. And this is when you stop sweating. So like I said, observing your coworkers, if they're normally, all about the perspiration, and suddenly they look cool as a cucumber, and, you've got 110 heat index out there, they're probably on the road to death. You also have the fast cooker, the exertional heat stroke, and that affects your laborers as well as athletes. And we call ourselves industrial athletes now, right? Rapid onset does not allow time for dehydration to occur. So those people, 50% of the time, are still sweating, and yet they're about to collapse. So that is the distinction between the classic and the exertional heat stroke, is whether you're sweating or you're not sweating. The person's body will feel hot when they're touched. Their mental state will be altered, and that is a big distinction between the heat exhaustion and the heat stroke. They may have seizures, and again, one of the lifeguards, I think she was 16, at our pool, had a seizure and had to be taken away in an ambulance. But that is one of the defined signs. Coma, you can go into that. At that point, it's a little bit late to be looking at first aid. So what do? Well, you get them immediate medical attention. Even if they say, oh, no, I'm fine. Get them medical attention. Move them out of the heat. Get them down to their skivvies. Don't worry about modesty. Obviously, try to have some decorum and privacy for the person if you can. Keep their head and shoulders elevated. So remember, heat exhaustion, you were elevating the feet. Now you're elevating the head and shoulders. Cool them down as best you can. Cold water, ice, get that igloo cooler, and start pouring it on them. And by the time people get to this, their core body temperature may be up to 105 degrees. And that's when you start going into organ failure as well as brain damage potentially from this. And then that last condition is a medical condition where heat stress or other conditions, including prolonged physical exertion, can result in electrolytes and proteins being released into the bloodstream. That can cause your kidneys to shut down. It can cause heart arrhythmia, and then it can cause death. Muscle cramps, muscle pain, dark urine is another sign of that. Weakness, exercise intolerance, and joint and pain and stiffness. So this is very, very serious. But you're not diagnosing this out in the field. This is usually determined after the person is already hospitalized, and usually an extended hospitalization is going to be involved in that. The personal factors, we've talked about all of those already. When I say obesity, I'm not talking about the person who, is a size 10 and thinks they should be a size 8. No, we're talking about a body mass index that is greater than or equal to 30. And diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, fitness level, use of diuretics, some psych and other blood pressure meds can also put you at an elevated risk for heat illness. If you use alcohol, alcohol is dehydrating. Even as it feels like you're being hydrated, pounding that six-pack, it is dehydrating you. And some drugs can also be complicating factors: opioids, methamphetamine, and cocaine. So if you have any of these pre-existing conditions, talk to your doc to find out whether you should even do the job. And then let's not forget skin cancer. There was a very famous, graduation address that was taped. Baz Luhrmann did as a joke, or always use sunscreen. But it's true. Skin cancer, if it is work related, you're going to be on the hook for that. Make sunscreen available for your outdoor workers because it does lose its effectiveness when people are sweating heavily. Reapply it often, and consider clothing that has protection built in. So what are some of the solutions here? First, create a heat illness prevention plan. And in doing so, consider who is going to be implementing it, who's going to provide daily oversight, how are you going to address the acclimatizing of your new and returning workers, how are you going to address temp workers who might come in for a short period and may not be acclimatized, how are you going to provide first aid and emergency assistance, what engineering and work practices might be effective in mitigating heat exposures, how about administrative controls, what PPE is going to be impacted potentially, and I will include the cloth face coverings in there as well. What are you going to do when there's a new National Weather Service alert or a warning? Yes, OSHA cannot enforce using that, but you cannot just put blinders on as a supervisor or an employer. What training are you going to give them? And, both for supervisors and for workers, it may be some overlapping training. There may be some additional training needed for your supervisors. And what ultimately is going to be your benchmark to determine if the total heat stress situation is hazardous to your work crew. In terms of training, train them on the importance of proper hydration, the need to drink fluids every 15 to 20 minutes, the differences in heat protective clothing and equipment, the sun resistant clothing that's out there now. There's lots of that stuff available. The human factors, make sure they're aware that they may be at a heightened risk due to individualized conditions. how to acclimatize, how and when to report symptoms, and also how to observe signs and symptoms of heat illness in your coworkers. And then finally, how to respond to emergency weather bulletins. All of those are pretty critical for your workers to understand. Other solutions, water, making sure that it's available, potable, again, not dirty water out of a ditch. But in a day's work out in the heat, you can sweat 2 to 3 gallons. That's an awful lot of water. And people really don't realize how much fluid they are losing. The rule of thumb is 5 to 7 ounces of fluid every 15 to 20 minutes when you are working in extreme heat conditions. And, don't give workers salt tablets. That generally is not a good idea. There's also physiologic monitoring. This gets into a bit of the safety engineering side of things. There are physiologic monitoring devices you can use, heart rate measurements. If people have Fitbits or some of the other devices that they wear that measure their pulse and some of these other factors, you can perhaps integrate those right into your programs, or maybe even give workers Fitbits to wear so that they can monitor this. Be aware, some of the impermeable clothing is going to contribute to heat stress, even at lower temperatures, because the sweat is not going to evaporate. There are environmental monitoring approaches using the wet bulb globe test, but they may not give an accurate indication of a worker's heat stress. The biometric monitors are probably the most effective way to individually know what is going on with your worker. And then another thing is to monitor weight change. It may sound embarrassing to ask your workers to get on a scale, but if they are losing weight rapidly during the day, that's another sign that they may be going into some medically dangerous dehydration. Most of the companies now have some kind of thermometers on the site because of COVID screening, so you can use those. But be careful, because environmental heat can affect some of those. And, there are oral temperatures, there's ear temperatures. Most of us are using the touchless ones that you can beam at the forehead. Again, just remember that, those can be subject to some manipulation. And I don't mean that in a sneaky way, but just because of the ambient heat conditions. And then I just want to note that OSHA and NIOSH have a heat stress app that you can put on your phone. It features real-time heat index and hourly forecast. It also has some good training material right on the app, so you can use that out in the field for toolbox training, or for safety huddles. There's a lot of stuff in here: a visual indicator of the current heat index, precautionary recommendations, hourly forecast. You can edit the location, and it also gives you information on first aid. So I've given you the link so you can download that, but be aware, there are a few considerations, and they've recognized these. This isn't me bashing NIOSH. They just said that this heat index value anticipated shady and light wind conditions. And so in full sunshine, heat index values can be increased by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The simplicity of this is good in a lot of ways, but if you have the ability, NIOSH still recommends using the wet bulb globe test, also looking at recommended exposure limits for hot environments. And ACGIH has some recommendations as well on how you can assess heat stress. NIOSH and OSHA, they're currently working on updating this with new scientific data. So they keep upgrading it. You have to check to make sure you're downloading the current updates if this is something that you are using in the field. And then lastly, there are a number of other resources that you have, and I just wanted to capture those for you, including the ACGIH, whatever the latest edition is that you have of their TLB and biological indexes. They address thermal stress, including heat stress and heat strain. So that's, if you have an industrial hygienist on your staff, they're probably already in possession of that and can guide you. The military also has some heat stress rules, and they have a very good guide out. So I've given you the link to that as well. And then the Center for Protection of Workers' Rights, CPWR, they have a good one-pager for construction workers. So a lot of stuff out there. There's a podcast that the CDC has if you like listening to those rather than reading materials. If you are in agriculture, there was some unique information on that that was put out jointly by OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency. So a lot of tools at your disposal. I do hope that you can stay cool. I know we went a little bit late here, but let's see. Do we have any questions on there? And I'm happy to stay on and answer them if I can.
Thank you, Adele. This is Debbie Jennings with the Chesapeake Region Safety Council, and we have a few things to add to the end of this. The first is the presentation will be on our website under the resources page. We also have 30 other webinars, many of them by Adele, as she worked through all of the COVID issues with us from the last several years. And again, you can find that at chesapeakesc.org resources, and all of the videos and webinars are there. We have two follow-up items. One was a statement and one was a question. The first was a statement, and it is from Sissy Martin of MOSH, Maryland Occupational Safety and Health.
Hi,
She's on
Sissy.
the advisory board, and there will be some street heat stress regulation meetings around the state of Maryland in September. And you can go to the Occupational Safety and Health for Maryland's website and find them in your region and register to attend. The next is a question from Tim Paz, and it is, can an OSHA professional take heart rate and oral temperatures on employees as a proactive heat stress and strain management program? He was once advised by an occupational physician with a law degree that I couldn't take these measurements as this activity was considered as providing a medical exam or first aid treatment. The person was a contractor, as I recall, who was reporting dizziness and exhaustion.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I attempted to dance around it a little bit, to be honest, earlier. If you build these screenings into your COVID screening, we have some protective cover, basically, from a legal perspective, because OSHA and the EEOC have both said that taking an employee's temperature as part of medical screening for COVID is not considered a medical examination, and so it does not violate the workers' rights under any of the employment laws. As far as using an oral temperature, versus the touchless, the main concern I'd have about that is how are you preventing cross-contamination? Workers may be reticent to have you stick something in their mouth that's been in somebody else's mouth. And if you have the sleeves on them that the medical professionals use, that's fine. But I think, if you can, and again, having said that already that, the heat can be a confounding factor in using the touchless ones, that still is probably your safer approach to that. Now, for contractors, you threw another, this is almost like a law school exam question in there. Ideally, your contractor's supervisor would be screening their own workers so that you're not in a position of screening a third party. Now, having said all of that, I'm going to default to sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to ask permission. And if you have somebody who collapses on your work site and you try to take their temperature to determine whether you need to call 911, and in fact they are experiencing a medical emergency, and you managed to save them, if they turned around and tried to sue you for violating their rights by taking their temperature, I don't think that they would get real far in that case, because common sense usually does prevail. And if nothing else, you might be able to fall back on a Good Samaritan exemption there. But these are all very, very good questions, especially if you use a lot of contractors or temporary workers in your workplace. Think about that when you are planning your program. Think about who is going to implement it. I had that on the earlier slide. Maybe part of your pre-qualification with your contractor is that they need to have somebody who is trained on heat stress and be prepared to monitor their own workers. You can build things into your contracts, especially if you are the host employer or the GC, because you have that purchasing power.
Thank you. We've actually had one more that just came in. The
for it.
question is, for MSHA reporting as a contractor, would both the contractor and the host mine need to report to MSHA?
That is also a great question. MSHA considers contractors to be mine operators. It's defined as that in the Mine Act. And so if you're a contractor and it's your worker who has the illness, you are the one responsible for reporting that. And if you don't already have an MSHA ID, a contractor ID assigned to you, at that point, you can fill out a form right online. They'll assign you an ID, and then you can use that for your reporting. Now, if you are, I would say, a visitor at a mine site and collapse there and aren't technically a contractor, then the mine operator, the host mine operator, may end up doing the report. And indeed, if you don't do the report, the mine operator should do it because one of the entities needs to do it. And there is a spot on that form to check off whether you are a mine employee or a contractor employee. But it's a $5,000 mandatory minimum penalty for not calling MSHA within the 15 minutes. But you also, even if you notify them, you also have to fill out their form 7000-1 and file that online. And it is a bit different than with OSHA. You don't just do a log. You have to file the injury report, even if it does not result in hospitalization, but if it results in medical treatment beyond first aid, within 10 working days. And you have to use their form, and it has to be filed online. So again, a bit more complicated when it comes to my friends over at MSHA.
And we have one more, Adele. Last one. Do we need SDS on the sports liquids that we provide to our employees?
I would say no, and SDS, for those who might be listening, safety data sheet. The liquids that you're giving them are not hazardous chemicals, I hope. You're not having them drink brake fluid for hydration. And so these would fall under the commercial products, I think, exemption. I mean, water itself, yes, you can have water intoxication that can kill you, but you don't need to have a safety data sheet on H2O. And similarly, if you're getting one of the sports drinks that have electrolytes, there's no danger. You don't need PPE for them. You don't have an overdose potential. And so they would not fall under the HAZCOM standard either.
Thank you. For anybody else that might have a question that comes up later, you can certainly email that to safety@chesapeakesc.org and we will get them to Adele. You're always very generous with your time and we appreciate it. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Stay cool.